Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to focus on the 1970s and address how globalization impacted the US economy. So, as you probably know, many of you probably have what are called service industry jobs, where you work at a counter, right? You sell a product, whether it be a hamburger or a cafe latte or something. And our economy used to be very different from that, but the 1970s is where you begin to see that service-driven type of economy. Here's a picture of that I'll address in the lecture, but of a company that was part of the steel mill industry in the Midwest. And by the 1970s, there's this big kind of shutdown of what we would call manufacturing type of jobs. So we'll look at the US economy in the 1970s and how really what I want you to take away from this is how multinational corporations ended this idea of the American dream, and I'll explain what this means. So I want to show you another picture, right? Looking at what life was life like in the 1970s. This is in New York. Looking at how the city kind of almost felt like it was kind of collapsing. We talked about the 1950s. There's a big exodus, right, of people moving to the suburbs, and the cities are kind of left to some extent rot. That has completely changed since then, right? Now people want to go back to the cities. We see places in New York being gentrified, and a lot of them are quote unquote up and coming. So it's funny how things are always shifting. Another example would be Detroit, right? It saw a large exodus in the 50s and 60s. You see a lot of houses that are kind of falling apart, but then you see a resurgence in the last 20 years of people wanting to go back and maybe rebuild basically the city, but the economy changes. A good example, though, a much more closer example, will be something like Jerome. If you ever go to Jerome, that's a great example of what happened there, right? These are big kind of copper mining industries in our state of Arizona. And when the mining ends, what happens, right? These little towns begin to disappear. And if you ever travel throughout the state, you are able to go to a place, Jerome, because the economy shifted there, right? There's no longer these kind of good paying jobs in the mining industry, but rather you have, these kind of art communities. So it took a while to get to the level that it is today, but you see that transition happen probably in the last 20 years in a place like Jerome, Arizona. So we're going to explain the impact of globalization on the U.S. economy. As a worker, it's really hard to put in words what you're going through when when your factory closes, right? You're frustrated, you're angry, and you want to blame somebody because you can't blame yourself. You blame, political parties or something like that, right? But the reality is that, the economy changes, unfortunately. And, slowly but surely it's been getting global and global and global. And we're going to touch on that, particularly how corporations, right? These corporations that sell you America now suddenly don't really care about America, right? There's a whole market out there that they want to tap into. So they begin to move to different parts of not only the United States, but different parts of the world. Why? Not so much only to reach that new kind of consumer, but really to lower their cost from everything from like production and manufacturing. And they begin to try to convince the American public, hey, this is good for you. And we're going to see how they do this. All right. So we'll look at all this and see the way it impacted the American economy. So let's start. So if you recall the 1960s, right, it's a time of particularly economic prosperity for mostly Anglo-Americans. Obviously, some minorities did move up. But also we see that things were changing, just as minorities. So here we're talking about women, people of color, even poor whites, right? The gay community, et cetera, started to gain entrance into a booming economy with the passing of civil rights laws, such as healthcare, for older and poor Americans, and other legislation that tried to target poverty and inequality in the US, there was a major economic shift that swept the rug from underneath them. Let's first examine how outside factors helped shape the economic downturn of the 1970s, and then we will explore how domestic policies and a new type of economy changed and essentially ended any hope for an American dream for a few generations. In 1974, the US entered its worst recession since the Great Depression, suffering from what had been defined as stagflation, where there was high unemployment, all the while inflation kept rising. So what causes economic downturn? Let's first explore the global factors before we focus on domestic issues. I first want to start with examining China, since this is something that still impacts us today. As I'm sure you are all aware, many of the things that we purchase today are manufactured in China due to the cheap labor and limited regulations that they follow. Since the Mao Communist revolutions during the mid-20th century, the US had limited communication with China, prevented them from joining the UN, and had a trade boycott and loan ban, and tried to stop the other countries from trading with them. It was during the Nixon presidency when there was a shift, as he saw this as an opportunity since China and the USSR were at conflict. So this is that idea of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But 1971, there were talks between the two nations and tensions eased, allowing Nixon himself to travel to the country in 1972. By this period, most European nations had already normalized relations with China, and it was only a matter of time before the US needed to reach this realization. In addition, Nixon hoped that this relationship could help end the Vietnam War and help the US reassert its dominance in the Southeast Asia region. In short, this opened up China to the US, but it also set in motion a Chinese nation that had bigger ambitions. First, the US removed Taiwan, a close ally, from the UN and replaced it with China, acknowledging that Taiwan was part of their nation. Second, it agreed to remove any trade and travel restrictions, which increased travel to China significantly. This was seen as one of Nixon's major accomplishments. However, in the long run, we have seen how it negatively impacted the US economy, particularly when it comes to manufacturing. So not only did it bit us in the behind back then, but definitely impacted us today. The next example, the second foreign issue, was a Middle East war between Israel against the Egyptians and Syria called the Yom Kippur War of October 1973. You might be aware that America was dependent on foreign oil, and though the US only represented about, quote, 6% of the world's population, it consumed nearly 40% of global energy resources, unquote. Just to give you context, American cars in the 1970s only got about 13 to 14 miles per gallon, while larger sedans got 6 miles per gallon. In this conflict, the US supported Israel by providing them with planes, tanks, and ammunition, which caused Saudi Arabia to impose an oil embargo against the US. And it destabilized the world oil market, causing an energy crisis and worsening the US economy. Eventually, a ceasefire was reached, but this conflict showcased how dependent the US was on foreign regions, while funny enough caused the US to develop stronger ties to Iran in order to import oil from that region and lessen the dependency on the Saudis. Interesting, this brought Iran and Saudi Arabia closer together, helping them to strengthen the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, what is now called OPEC, and stabilizing the region until the late 1970s when the Shah of Iran was overthrown. Understand that Americans are dependent on their cars. Again, this move to the suburb caused them to drive everywhere, from the grocery store into the city to go watch a baseball or football game, right? If you needed to go down the street, more than likely you would have driven your car. The last example I want to address is Japan. So after World War II had destroyed a lot of nations. However, it also helped in the sense that many had to rebuild with modern, more efficient infrastructure and technology. In the 1950s, the U.S., quote, accounted for 40% of the value of all the goods and services produced around the world. By 1970, it was down to 23%. By the end of the 1970s, the U.S. imported more manufactured goods than it exported, unquote. This was due to a few factors which I will mention later, but in regards to Japan, it manufactured cheaper and better goods than the US, exporting cars, televisions, and cameras. For example, in 1970, American car companies such as GM, Ford, and Chrysler sold 89% of the cars marketed in the US. However, within 10 years, their market share dropped to 66%. In the steel industry, once the backbone of America, in the 1950s, the U.S. produced nearly 50% of the world's steel, but by 1980, it only accounted for 14%, which was due in part because a nation like Japan heavily invested in research and innovation, allowing them to produce a ton of steel for a third of the price it costs American factories. This would drive a major blow to the U.S. economy, particularly the middle class, that helped build the suburbs of the 1950s, as manufacturing jobs left, causing a quote-unquote rust belt in the Northeast and the Midwest with high unemployment, crumbling roads, bankrupting governments, and high welfare rolls. Domestically, the U.S. economy was in shambles. Prior to the 1970s, though, for many Americans, it seemed like the good times would never end. The previous 30 years have proven that the American dream was within reach for everyone. Real per capita family income doubled, and the GDP more than doubled, along with the economy expanding, increasing the standard of living for most Americans. So you have to understand that Americans felt that this economic increase for the last 30 years was never going to end. The assumption was that we had plenty of resources, plenty of goods, plenty of jobs, and that it could only continue. And these factors that I just mentioned put an end to that type of thinking, though Americans seem to be dumbfounded by what was taking place, right? They kind of grew accustomed to all this. So let's look at the collapse of liberalism. The Great Society in the Vietnam War, along with tax cuts from all previous presidents, injected money into the U.S. economy, so much so that it overstimulated it. With plenty of jobs available, strong consumer demand drove up prices, which put pressure on wages. With inflation increasing, the Federal Reserve shrunk the money supply and caused interest rates to reach their highest levels since the 1920s. This in turn weakened the once booming economy, causing not only an economic collapse, but also a political shift to the right. With many Americans disillusioned, ending in the belief of 1960s-style liberalism, which for many, quote, associated with foreign policy failures, inflationary domestic policies, oversized government, high taxes, and a generalized permissiveness and moral decay, unquote. In 1971, Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard, causing the value of the US dollar to be determined by international currency markets. In doing this, Nixon hoped that by lowering the value of the dollar, it could better compete with the German mark and Japanese yen and help promote exports by making American goods cheaper overseas and reduce imports, since foreign products would be more expensive in the US. This in turn caused the, quote, price of gold to increase from $35 an ounce to $800 an ounce, and added to the inflationary burden on American consumers. As you can see, it made things worse, not better. By 1973, the economy was doing something that was not common. Unemployment was increasing at 9% by 1975, which meant that inflation should have dropped, since people typically would not purchase things because they lack a job and the economic power to do so. However, the economy saw the opposite, with inflation increasing, causing this new concept called stagflation. The oil embargo by Saudi Arabia mentioned earlier caused long lines of gas stations, with them either running out quickly or limiting how much people could purchase. It was really a complete mess. Here's a picture with a guy and his lawnmower. Remember that the U.S. was the land of plenty. So for many Americans, having to conserve was unheard of and just seemed un-American. In fact, daily consumption of imported oil rose from 12% in 1968 to 36% by 1973. Although the embargo did not last that long, so it ended by March of 1974, it did cause the price of gas to increase from 30 to 70 cents, and then remained there for the rest of the decade. Congress passed speed limit laws on interstate highways to 55 miles per hour in order to limit consumption rather than it being related to safety. Beyond cars, oil had a trickle-down impact since it is used for many different products, such as the heating and lighting of buildings was synthesized into fibers and plastics. Farmers used it for fertilizer and pesticides, and obviously for their fuel, and for the transportation of goods, thus increasing the price of many goods and services. This is also the time where people begin to buy Japanese cars because they are more fuel efficient, saving them on gas, and obviously prices going up on a gallon of gas. Another issue is deindustrialization. So hopefully you have heard this word before. We've seen in the last 50 years, basically. So a major culprit was not so much the price of gas or leaving the gold standard, but rather the shifting of economic centers. New industries had emerged since the 1850s, and the U.S. was always able to harness that innovation and build factories to mass produce goods. However, by the 1970s, things went in reverse as factories began to close and our economy focused more on sales and retail sectors, quote, intensifying a 20-year trend towards a service-centered economy, unquote. As with the example provided earlier with Japan, the U.S. promoted industries to invest in overseas plants, along with companies investing in automation within the states, while shifting production to low-wage areas such as the Sun Belt, which tended to be anti-union. Remember that unions built the middle class. High-tech industries emerged in the southwest regions, in cities like Dallas, Orlando, Phoenix, San Diego, and Los Angeles, along with a growing service economy, which focused on leisure and consumption, flocking to places such as Disneyland and Vegas to gamble the little money people had. Unions, those once mighty organizations that literally helped build the U.S. middle class, lost thousands of members as companies either automated their industries or moved to quote-unquote developing nations such as Mexico, Vietnam, and China. Remember, that's Nixon opened up China. So, for example, in Youngstown, Ohio, that picture I showed you at the beginning, right? The Campbell Works of the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company shut down. Once known as the quote-unquote Steel City that offered economic opportunities to generations of Ohioans, it was now, quote, an inefficient antique that made steel more slowly and expensively than new mills, unquote. 5,000 workers lost their job, and the mill reflected the reality of deindustrialization. One union official noted that, quote, our fathers worked here, and our grandfathers worked here. Now I face the prospect of this turning into a ghost town. They used to tell us, get out of high school, get a job at the mill, and you'll be fixed for life. Now I know better, unquote. Many stayed, but some knew that the mill was never coming back, and left for the Sun Belt. Others looked for work locally, but found jobs that did not pay nearly as well as the mill. The impact went beyond just those from the mills, as a local tavern where workers stopped for a drink before heading home closed since they no longer had those mill customers. These workers that were once able to make ends meet with a single income could not find comparable work that offered good pay with benefits. Some workers were forced into retirement or had to get a service job, such as working at McDonald's, as they, quote, became the nation's largest employer, where we saw the fast food industry add workers faster than manufacturing lost them. These McJobs, as they were known, paid 1/3 as much and came with far fewer benefits, unquote. In order to cope with the loss of class status, many families came to the realization that one income was no longer going to be enough. So women entered the job market, taking full-time jobs, increasing their presence to 50% by the 1980s. Compare that to 36% in the 1960s. This would have a psychological impact on the American worker, but also on the myth of the American dream. The belief was that if you worked hard, had some sort of talent, and took the initiative, then you would be rewarded with upward mobility and economic security. The 1970s blew that notion apart and eroded our faith in the work ethic, since millions of Americans could not find manufacturing jobs that provided good salaries along with benefits such as retirement and healthcare. Rather, most workers were fighting with each other for crumbs, trying not to move up, but rather to not fall any further, causing an increase in economic inequality. So what caused this, and how much fault can we put on the American working class? As noted earlier, it was Richard Nixon who opened China for business, and corporations took advantage of this opportunity. Though Nixon got the short-term political points for establishing good relations with China, the long-term impact would be something the rest of the US would have to pay for. However, we cannot sit here and just put the blame on one president or a country. Rather, I want to address the idea of multinationals. Many of you probably work for some large corporation, and more than likely you recognize that you are replaceable, as you are just an integer regardless of how much they pay or the accolades they give you. Their corporate growth and movement is nothing new. What we see happening in the 1970s is a key reason why our economy has shifted and the middle class has shrunk so much. Multinational corporations are, as their name indicates, faceless corporations that have factories and other operations in several nations. These companies are borderless and have no ties to a nation state. However, as one historian noted, they have no problem the US protecting them, right? Think of something like Coca-Cola, which you can purchase anywhere in the world. And they're also producing them all over the world, right? So in the 1970s, quote, US firms made up the majority of the largest multinationals, and as the American workers struggled, these firms earned huge profits because 25% of their holdings were overseas, unquote. For the majority of corporations, it was a no-brainer to move as they had no allegiance to the US, who helped them succeed, and they opted to move to Mexico or China because of the cheap labor and the lack of regulations. Multinational executives worked hard to convince the American public that moving overseas was good for everybody because it, quote, increased jobs and prosperity in the US, and they insisted that capital invested in Mexico and in Asia came back home as dividends to stockholders and tax payments to the government, unquote. So I want you to try to grasp that argument that somehow them moving middle-class jobs to other parts of the world was good for the US. From their statement, it sounds like it was great for stockholders. So by the time President Carter took over, the writing was on the wall. The fact was that the US was in a time of transition, and no presidential policy could quickly fix this shift, but rather would take a decade, increasing the gap between the rich and the poor and expand the ever-growing job markets between service jobs and new high-tech jobs. However, that didn't mean that people did not put the blame at the footstep of the president. When Carter entered the White House, inflation sat around 6%, while unemployment was at 8%. His plan to tackle this was by pumping $6 billion to public works projects and $8 billion for public service jobs. Tax cuts, so implementing tax cuts, and increase the minimum wage, which helped lower the unemployment rate to 6%, while at the same time increasing inflation to 10%, reaching 13% by 1980. In an era where people were tired of quote-unquote 1960-style liberalism, Carter began to deregulate different industries, highlighted by the airline industry when he eliminated price control for air flights. By doing this, the theory was that it, quote, would lower costs, increase competition, and improve service, unquote. The reality was the opposite, and yes, in the short term, it lowered prices, but in the long term, it drove airlines into bankruptcies or to be taken over by larger firms. For the consumer, it made flying more affordable, but the trade-off was crowded flights. And you know this today, right? They try to pack in as many seats as possible. It caused delays, and it overworked and underpaid flight attendants. Even the food in the flights changed from something that once compared to first-class service to now peanuts and potato chips. Carter tried other initiatives such as increasing the production of nuclear power, but faced pushback from both conservatives and liberals. Conservatives felt that expanding nuclear power also expanded the authority of the federal government, and by this time conservatives pushed for smaller government when it was convenient. However, they still depended on big government. And, quote, liberals, along with environmentalists, objected to its support for nuclear power and oil company profits, unquote. In March of 1979, a nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island, Pennsylvania, nearly suffered a catastrophic meltdown and shuttered permanently, therefore ending any other proposal for a new nuclear plant. When Carter gave his infamous Crisis of the Spirit speech, he told Americans that, quote, all legislation in the world can't fix what's wrong with America. What is lacking is confidence and a sense of community. His words did not resonate the way he thought they would, and they certainly were nothing like FDR's speech of, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. Rather, for many Americans, it felt like he was talking down to them and putting the blame on them. Add to this the overthrow of the Shah of Iran, causing another oil price increase, and we find that the U.S. was not on stable ground. Carter had become more unpopular than Nixon with an approval rate of 26%. As noted earlier, liberalism was hanging on by a thread, and the writing was on the wall that a major shift was about to take place. Things could not get any worse, or at least people didn't want them to. And people were tired of struggling to survive and saw a new political direction. So for many, it was morning in America. So yeah, here's some pictures, right? McDonald's all over the world. And over here you see Jimmy Carter trying to pump money into the economy, just, causing more inflation in the latter part of the 1970s. So in conclusion, I want you to take away that the 1970s was dominated by economic hardships, right? This idea called stagflation. And what's really key here is that the middle class was declining. Things were not good. As I noted, right, the majority of our workers were struggling. New economic centers were developing. But all this was really in relation to what was happening by the economic sector, right? This idea of globalization, where American companies who, prided themselves in selling to Americans and, waving the American flag, had no allegiance to us. And the moment, they were able to find cheap labor around the world, hey, they took off, and, set up shop somewhere else. And unfortunately, that impacted, the American working class. All right, so, we'll end it there. And this kind of summarizes the 1970s in a nutshell. Have a good day.